Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Last week, I had my eye on UNGA, the UN General Assembly, at the 77th such gathering in New York City. What was remarkable about UNGA this year is that all of the leaders of the world, after 2 years of basically delivering their speeches by video recording because of the COVID pandemic, were actually able to turn up in person and have a serious adult conversation about all of the problems that the world is facing. 190 of the 193 countries of the UN were represented, and 126 leaders made the effort to be in New York in person. What they heard at the General Assembly was rather sobering. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, warned of a global dysfunction. African leaders warned about increasing violence on their continent. The head of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, warned of imminent starvation for 50 million people around the world today. And the president of the General Assembly, Székely Kőrösi of Hungary, pointed out that although much of the focus was on the war in Ukraine, there were 30 other conflicts in the world, none of which were getting any better. Indeed, for many observers, this UNGA meeting seemed to mark a sort of a transition from the post-Cold War world in which things have been rather bumpy, but we've at least been spared sort of global cataclysmic warfare. Most conflicts have been short and have been localized, to a possible new world of geopolitical competition, of rising spending on armaments, on military budgets, a greater appetite for risk-taking, particularly to impose grandiose historical visions like the recreation of the Tsarist Empire by Vladimir Putin, which pose much greater dangers. So this has led me to think for this week's eye about how do we prevent future wars, given that in the case of Ukraine, we see that they not only produce immense suffering for people in theater, like Ukrainians and increasingly Russians, but in terms of hunger, in terms of inflation, in terms of energy, for much of the rest of the planet as well. Well, I think in the first place, we have to recognize that there are a lot of disputes in the world, a lot of tensions, but they don't all lead to war. Many of them sort of erupt into violence occasionally, simmer, but are kept largely under control. Think of Israel-Palestine, think of China and India on the Himalayan plateau, think of relations between unionists and nationalists in Northern Ireland. So what actually tips situations or induces political leaders to take all of the risk of actually launching a war? Well, academic research, I think, can be useful to us here because it's pointed to 5 factors. Number one, the accumulation of absolute power by single individuals who gradually become isolated from reality, living in a bubble, who are convinced of their own infallibility. What has worked for them in the past, they believe, will automatically work in the future. The checks and balances that could hold them at bay have largely disappeared. As they get more power, they have fewer interests to balance, fewer constituencies that they need to address. Now, that doesn't mean to say that checks and balances, by the way, necessarily have to be a democracy. Even a corrupt elite, even oligarchs can play that kind of role. It could be the military, it could be the intelligence service, but where you see societies when there are no checks and balances, even within the regime at all, then you start to worry. The second thing is misperception. It's the sense that our adversary is weak and war will pay because we will be able to accomplish our goals quickly. And you can see in the case of Ukraine the way in which Putin has really misperceived the unity of Ukraine based on the fact that it resisted little when Crimea was annexed in 2014, the belief that because Russia has interfered in Ukrainian affairs for years, because in Putin's view the West was divided from the East, that somehow Ukraine would welcome liberation by Russians. That kind of miscalculation also is at the heart of a lot of conflicts. The third factor is uncertainty, which might strike you somewhat counterintuitive. Would not uncertainty stop aggressive war? No, it doesn't. It has the opposite effect, because uncertainty means that I cannot prove to you that your war is going to be a disaster. All options are on the table, and that leads dictators to believe that their option, war, is just as good or just as likely to succeed as anything else. the fourth factor is commitment. You know, that leaders get sort of attached to sort of certain causes, and they feel that even where they fail, like Russia is failing at the moment in Ukraine, it would be too much of a humiliation to back away. The response to defeat is not to accept a compromised peace, but to double down, to escalate, to take even greater risks in the hope of salvaging the situation. And you see Putin, of course, doing that with threats of nuclear weapons at the moment in Ukraine, the annexation of Ukrainian territory, the mobilization of Russian soldiers, and all of these kind of things. And then the final factor is where countries don't control certain factions that push towards the extreme. You know, you think of Myanmar, with the tragic experience of the military never being controlled by the civilian governments and launching coups and taking over and pushing the country into civil war. You think of Germany before 1914, where the parliament under the domination of the Social Democrats was a modern European type of governance system, but unfortunately had little control over the Kaiser and the German military establishment, with its gloomier view of geopolitics, pushing for war while Germany could still dominate Europe. Maybe the modern equivalent of that would be sort of cyber, where you have proxies linked to the state carrying out destructive cyber attacks, which again could drag the state itself into an international crisis. So if those are the factors, clearly we need to start thinking about what we do about them. Now, I don't have any simple solutions here because there aren't any. It's not easy. And nothing is guaranteed to succeed. But clearly we need to have a warning sign where people gain absolute power and where checks and balances start falling away. That's obviously going to start giving us headaches. And what can we do to re-establish those checks and balances by supporting different factions within authoritarian states, for example, who have a greater interest in peace, even if they don't like us and we don't particularly like them? Misperceptions, how can we really sort of counter this idea of the weakness of adversaries, that war is going to be quick, that war is going to be easy? How, for example, do we solve this issue of uncertainty? I think Ukraine has shown at least a big attempt to do that, with the West warning Putin of sanctions in advance, making it clear that the West would give assistance to Ukraine, for instance, that NATO would not back down from its policy of enlargement and all of that. Well, it failed. Putin still went ahead. But that doesn't mean to say that reducing that kind of uncertainty isn't something that we should try in future. Commitment, well, that's not easy, where leaders can't be really talked out of courses of action that they're launched. But at least we can offer them negotiations. We can offer them off-ramps. We have to keep the channels of dialogue open. Maybe they won't accept those channels, but maybe people in their entourage who realize that the leader is carrying the country into nemesis will accept those kind of offers. Where it comes to proxies, we need to make it very clear to states what the consequences will be if they lose control of different factions of their society. I mean, decentralization of power can help. Kenya showed this when, after violent elections in 2007, it decentralized power downwards to the regions. Other elections were still very turbulent, but we did not see anything like the repeat of violence that we saw before. But above all, the UN needs to think seriously about the role of mediators who can bring the parties around the table, use coercion, persuasion, inducements to make them accept that peace is more in their interests than continuing fighting. It also means we may have to accept peace in two stages, where you have a sort of difficult compromise peace at the beginning, which maybe still allows the warlords to survive for a time, because obviously they have to accept the outcome to stop fighting. But then in a second phase, you have a more democratic transition towards elections and a civil government and that kind of thing, which is more of a guarantee of long-term peace. Again, the answers are not easy. All I'm saying is that next year's UNGA, having really pulled the alarm cord this year, should start thinking about how the UN can be reformed, both to spot these factors in advance and to come up with imaginative solutions so that we can try to prevent wars. We may not be entirely successful, but if we don't even try, then it looks as if we're going to be condemned to live in a very violent remainder of the 21st century. Thank you for watching. I hope to be back next week with a somewhat more optimistic message, but from London, goodbye for now.